Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistanomy. My name is Uzair, and joining me today is Amir Husain, who's author of the book The Sentient Machine, and somebody who I first try to bother when there is a cutting edge development in the world of artificial intelligence or bleeding edge technology, because he's a technologist and an expert in this field. And as many of you may have already been aware, over the last few days, there's been a conversation about a breakthrough innovation coming out of China in the form of DeepSeek, and which headlines have said has changed the AI landscape, has led to a lot of commentary out of Silicon Valley on the innovation side, out of Washington and Europe on the policy side. So I figured having Amir would be very important to help me and all of us understand what really happened and what it means. So Amir, welcome to Pakistanomy and hope you're doing well.
Thank you very much, Uzair. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
I want to begin with sort of, you helping us understand what exactly is all the fuss about when it comes to DeepSeek. Obviously, Mark Andreessen, who's one of the voices on the venture capital side, has called it a Sputnik moment,
Mhm.
sort of alluding back to the old Cold War days when America was rattled by Soviet advancements. How do you see what has happened and what really has DeepSeek achieved here?
7 years ago, I was at the Center for a New American Security, CNAS, which is one of the main think tanks in DC. And I participated with them on their AI committee for a couple of years at least. And another person who was very active in that was Eric Schmidt of Google. So I remember 7 years ago, Eric and I had a discussion. And I had my opinion, but I asked Eric at the time, I said, how long do you think before China takes over from the US in terms of AI capability? And 7 years ago, he said 5 years. I saw him again at an event last year, and he mentioned something, um, kind of similar in the sense that, they're almost there. They're there. So the reason I highlight this conversation for you is there is to say this is only a surprise to people who haven't been following the Chinese, the work that they're doing, the level of technology that's coming out of China. It's very easy to dismiss things and say this is all copied, this is all nonsense, they stole it from us. But the reality is that in this particular case, actually, the facts of the matter are quite the opposite. Like, most of the companies that trained their LLMs to begin with took data from the internet without explicit permission. And now, of course, a lot of them are crying about the fact that DeepSeek used some interim output from somewhere. But at this point, a big percentage of the internet, a big percentage of the content that's on the internet is really all LLM output, right? Because of all of the applications that these things have been included in. So not to make it too long here now, but to say it's a Sputnik moment. Look, uh, it's definitely a wake-up call. Um, and I think that while the Sputnik moment led to massive American governmental investment in keeping up, I think this time is going to be very tough. It's not one-dimensional. And we'll talk about this because I think what people have taken great note of is DeepSeek, but the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks have been mind-blowing just across the board. So, yes, it is a wake-up call. I just don't know that we are in a position to act like we did after the Sputnik was launched. And also, I don't have too much time for people that talk about, that this is theft or this is in any way less than giving these Chinese researchers their due, which is that they've been at it for a long time, and people in the industry, people like say Eric Schmidt, myself, for 7 years we've been saying this is going to happen.
So and I agree with your view on this whole like crying about theft is a bit rich coming from platforms that themselves train their algos and are in courts right now, right? So let's not belabor that point. But you said, we're not there in terms of responding to it like we did in the Sputnik moment or the early Cold War era. I want to come back to that point in just a moment, but before I do that, I like to get in the weeds of things, and I would love to use this opportunity to learn from you and help our audience understand about what is the breakthrough innovation here, right? Because I was reading a few articles, they talk about this is a pure reasoning model, that it's sort of pure reinforcement learning, sorry. And that it's kind of, somebody explained to me, it's kind of like teaching a child to not touch a hot plate. Once they touch it, they learn, and then they sort of like grow up and understand that that thing is hot and what is heat, and they learn all of those things. Why is that? Why is reinforcement learning and pure reinforcement learning being talked about so much in terms of the advancements DeepSeek has made?
So first of all, there are a number of things that they've done. I've looked at the paper, and I can't say that, each and every one of them off the top of my head I'll be able to get into, but let me recount for you as much as I remember off the top of my head. The first thing is that generally training these large models is operationally quite a nightmare. I mean, there are a large number of GPUs connected on a large number of machines. Generally, things get stuck. Lots of stuff happens in just running a large parallel computational task of that type. And for a while now, there has been improvement in how these systems that watch all these GPUs being trained, because there's a well-known thing with at least university labs that whenever you run a big job like that, the grad students are always there overnight trying to restart things, kick things off. So there's a lot of involvement like that. Now, in a very large environment, that leads to quite a lot of downtime and inefficiency. So you can imagine certain GPUs are down, etc. Eventually, the task will complete, but it becomes inefficient. So one of the things that I've seen is that their framework for running these large parallel training jobs was very efficient. So you get a few points of efficiency by doing that. The second thing is that in general training, because what is a neural network? A neural network, they talk about weights. A neural network has weights. So what are weights? Weights are numeric labels, representations that are associated between two neurons that are connected. And so the weight really means how much of the output of this neuron will get propagated to the next stage. The higher the weight is, the more that propagation will be. Otherwise, the output will get multiplied by a very small number, will diminish, and then go forward. So those weights are really numbers. Those numbers can be high precision numbers. So, for example, 32-bit numbers with a lot of detail, to the right of the decimal place. But what these guys have done is they've used 8-bit. So that's a saving of 4x in terms of memory, right? You go from 30. Now, it's not like people previously haven't known that if we did like a, 8-bit number that our overall needs will come down in terms of training. But these guys have done it and they've done it without impacting the model. So that's a second area where they've picked up quite a bit of performance. The third area where they've picked up a bit of performance is that NVIDIA generally on these NVIDIA GPUs, there's a library, there's a way in which you access the GPU, which is called CUDA, CUDA. And these guys have gone one level below that because CUDA is a higher level of abstraction. You can talk to it in C, C++. But beneath that, there's like for lack of a better word, an assembly language for these GPUs, which is called PTX. And these guys have gone down and optimized code down to the PTX level. So they get some juice even further out of that by sidestepping CUDA and doing things super optimally. So there are at least these three things that they're doing to make their jobs run a lot faster. So some of the efficiency that you are seeing before we even get to the model is coming from the stack of innovation after innovation or technique after technique that they've applied. Now, that's one thing. Now, let's come to the model. So, you were talking about reinforcement learning and things of that nature. Well, there's a few things about this model that are interesting. First of all, it's a model that is a mixture of experts. What a mixture of experts versus a general kind of a model, the difference is that in a large model, let's say you've got 600 billion parameters, that model needs to be loaded into memory in order for it to do any task. Because any path through the model, again, you visualize that model being all these, billions of neurons connected together, all these weights. So you don't know what, based on what question, what path that inference will take. So you have to load the whole model up. And when you do that, now you've got a 670 or billion parameter model in memory. And even at inference time, even when you're trying to answer questions, forget about training, even at inference time, that's a lot. That's 670 billion, weights that you have to accommodate in memory and then run through the computation. What a mixture of experts does is it says, okay, the front part of a network, and you can even imagine this as multiple networks just for simplification. The front part of a network, it's going to be small, and the only job will be to act as a router. The job will be to take a query and then figure out where to send this query. And instead of having one big gargantuan model that knows it all, what we'll do is we'll separate the model out into areas, and that area is going to be one expert on some topic. Now, I don't want to say an expert on chemistry or biology and so on, because a lot of times you can actually do segmentation of queries that will land multiple queries in one area that for you or me might be chemistry or biology, but somehow in that higher dimensional space that these networks look at, they're all the same thing. So it's their definition of topics, not necessarily our definition of topics. But that mixture of experts model, what that does is it says, okay, there's a router, there's a front end here, which is figuring out where to send the answer. And then I'm going to send it to this or this or this. When those models get invoked and or that part of the model gets invoked, it's self-contained, meaning the full inference can run through it. And that might be a 30 billion parameter model. So at any given point in time, to answer a query, instead of having to load and run a 670 billion parameter model, you're now doing that with a model that is 12 times smaller, right? As an example. So that's another area where they've achieved some improvement. Mixture of experts has been known. There have been multiple implementations of it. By the way, I have been a long-time proponent of that approach because I have seen that in many of the domains I've been working, like for example, physical domains where you want to understand the physics of a thing, it just doesn't make sense to expect an LLM to know all that. It's far more likely that equipping an LLM either with a tool that it can use to invoke some rules of physics that give it an answer to then model a phenomenon it observes, or to have smaller models that are focused on these niche areas, that to me makes a lot more sense. So we've used similar techniques not for a large LLM, but for other areas and physical domains, and this approach, kind of does work very well. And the last thing that I'll say, and there's much more to say, and if you want, we go step two and we can go, dive deeper. But the other thing is around the reinforcement learning, which you brought up. So first of all, reinforcement learning can be used in multiple ways. And what is reinforcement learning? Reinforcement learning is this idea of a reward function being used to shape the behavior of a process. So a process can be doing something. It can be producing an output that might be an action. It can be producing an output that might be a series of steps in a game, or it might be a series of words that you produce as you output things as an LLM. So what you can do is one way of training something is to say, here's the question, here's the answer. Pair these things together. In some sense, pair these things together. This is the question, this is the right answer. So when the LLM learns, what the LLM does is it transforms this question into a series of tokens. Each one of those tokens gets transformed to a number. And then those numbers are observed. And over time, as you see more and more and more of these numbers kind of correlate, you build a model of language. You figure out what things coexist, generally what the orders of things are, and lots of stuff that we as humans find it very difficult to put our finger on. These models, and these are called embeddings, right? This whole notion of taking a word and transforming it into a vector, really. Those are embeddings. So I can do all of this and I can figure out what two questions are similar based on their embeddings. Where are they in embedding space? If they're similar in embedding space, it might be the same question. So I'm going to generate an answer that kind of looks like that. But this requires a question and an answer. Now, the other approach is to say, here's a question, and you produce an answer, and I'm going to give you a reward for it. I'm not going to tell you whether it's the right answer or the wrong answer or how you were wrong or why you were wrong, but I'm going to give you a reward for it. So this leads to very interesting behaviors even in physical systems, like in a reinforcement learning system where, let's say, you're using it to teach a robot how to walk, and you haven't really hard coded the human gait or anything like that. You might have a robot that does just random things. It's flipping its legs, it's flailing about, but at the end of a run, it moves 6 inches forward. So you'll give it a small reward. And you might have another instance where it doesn't move forward at all. You're not going to give it a reward. So it'll take what it did last time and then it'll mutate that slightly. And then variations of that mutation that lead to further distance being covered will get a slightly higher reward. And you might even say, okay, when you got to the full distance, you're going to get almost all of the reward, but I'm going to reserve some elements of the reward for things like style, for things like balance. And I'm not going to tell you what I'm reserving that for. You're just going to have to keep doing this over and over until the system learns to optimize to the reward and it starts to bring about oftentimes unexpected behaviors because we humans only think in certain ways. Machines can find ways that solve what we want solved, but in doing so, they might look different and they might act very differently. So this happens in AI quite a bit. Reinforcement learning is another element that they've used here rather than the traditional methods of training. Of course, in OpenAI, reinforcement learning is used as well because they do reinforcement learning from human feedback. So what they've done is they do the training, the question answer pairs. They've got these large data sets now, basically the entire internet scraped. Then there's also a lot of manual cleanup of these sets. But anyway, they train all of this, and you might still get an answer that's low quality. So you can say, I don't like it or I like it. And so over time, even as the system runs, you're getting human feedback. But of course, reinforcement learning can be used in so many different ways. These guys are doing it in a slightly different way. There's lots more to say about token at a time, multiple tokens being produced by the DeepSeek guys, which is also more efficient, and some other stuff that they've done. But in a nutshell, there's quite a lot of stuff that has all been kind of put together in a novel way, you know?
That's fascinating, and thank you for that in-depth analysis because as you were explaining all of the efficiency gains and the multiple ways in which they've achieved that, it brought to my mind the big thing that is obviously being talked about in at least the business media side, right? Which is how much did this thing cost? And why is it that it costs so little? And is that even true? Are they just like covering up their tracks in terms of the cost? And what does it mean for chip wars? And what does it mean for Nvidia stock price moving forward, etc.? So the efficiency gains really are showing that there's an optimization happening that was previously unknown, right? That's pure innovation that has happened. So now people are thinking about energy cost, GPU usage, etc. Which brings me to sort of the US-China chip war question, and I want to get your thoughts on that because there was this view, and I remember talking to a bunch of people, including yourself, over the last couple of years about whether these export controls on GPUs really make sense, will they work or not work, etc. And one view that I was leaning more towards and still do lean towards, would love your thoughts on this, was that export controls or curbs on chips and things like that impose scarcity. And scarcity is out of which real innovation can come out of because when you have a dearth of something, you're going to look for other ways to innovate, etc. And to me, as just a layman, when I read DeepSeek stuff and when I hear about all of the innovations that you just explained, this is just an expected outcome in my mind about all of the controls that have been imposed over the last few years on the Chinese ecosystem. What are your thoughts on that? Because right now we're hearing more in Washington that more export controls are coming and a tightening of these controls is being discussed. And would love your perspective on, is this even the right path forward?
I think, in general, at least the types of sanctions that I have studied and paid attention to, they tend to be some of the most uh, almost meaningless, as well as processes that kind of undercut what you were trying to do to begin with. As an example, obviously you may remember the sanctions against Pakistan on the F-16s, which led to what? Which led to a few years of pain, and then, an Air Force going out and creating its own fighter, which it says is better than what it lost access to. And now that fighter is being exported to multiple countries, to Iraq and Azerbaijan and Myanmar and Nigeria and others. With that came an entire ecosystem of weapons, which Pakistan couldn't have received. Previously, the American fighters would come with Lockheed Martin personnel to ensure that there were controls in place. Now, with the indigenous platform, there's no such limitation. So, in other words, didn't work. In the Clinton era, there was a limit. Prior to Clinton, there was a limit on MIPS, the uh, millions of instructions per second measure on computers was used to limit what could be exported and what couldn't be exported. Clinton came and raised the ceiling because for a long time it was quite clear that people were getting all the computers that they needed in any case, because in East Asia these computers were being produced, they were going directly. It compromised American companies' ability to export those computers because they had to comply with these export laws. When this whole PC revolution started, in many ways it was based here in Texas. CompuAdd, Dell, Compaq, all these companies were based here in Texas. And many of them no longer exist. And of course, the larger volume for PCs then started coming out of East Asia. And it just got shipped directly to anywhere in the world. So that MIPS limitation never worked out. Um, Another one was when the NSA pushed this idea of the Clipper chip, which was an encryption-oriented chip with a backdoor that only the NSA could access. And there was a lot of hullabaloo. This is in the late 90s, mid-late 90s. There was a lot of hullabaloo around that, and people were like, this is completely ridiculous, etc. The NSA tried to justify it for multiple years. And eventually, all the encryption technology, on which, by the way, there are still export controls, it's being done everywhere in the world, right? No one needs to import encryption capability from the US to be able to encrypt. I'll give you one more example with drones. After the 9/11, catastrophe here in the US, the US, moved into Afghanistan, then moved into Iraq, started using drones, these predators, and so on and so forth. A lot of partners in the region, including Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Iraq, numerous others, asked for, I believe Turkey also, they all asked for these drones because they're a tactical system, right? It's not like a drone is going to threaten anyone at a strategic level. It's a very specific tool of war. The US said, no, we're not going to give drones to anyone. We're not going to export drones. All of those countries that I named today are all either building their own drones or have signed deals with the
In
Chinese.
fact, if I may interrupt you, the Turkish drones have been extremely useful on the Ukrainian war front, where NATO ally Turkey has helped
Yeah.
Ukraine out a lot.
The Turkish drones are the most superior drones in all of Europe, and they are exporting Baker Technologies, which does that Bayraktar TB2, now TB3, and then also Kizil Elma, all these other drones that they've built. They are best in class. They're exported to dozens and dozens of countries. Pakistan is building its own. The Saudis did a deal with the Chinese. The Emiratis bought from the Chinese. The Iraqis used the CH-4 drone. Uh, the reason why I'm going through all of this is not kind of spontaneously. This has been a pet peeve of mine for a long time. I've also had conversations with the Department of Commerce here in the US about this, which is that at what point will we learn? At what point will we realize that these sanctions are counterproductive? Because what they do is they, first of all, incentivize the other party to go and acquire the capabilities. Second of all, they prevent the US from gaining any revenue from a situation. And someone else is now gaining that revenue. And just in purely competitive terms, you're allowing capital to shift towards a potential competitor. And number three, you are no longer part of the system now. So when the Chinese CH-4 drones are being used in the Middle East, any advisors that are helping figure out how those imaging systems work or how to interpret, deploy, what the right tactics are operationally, etc. Those people are not Americans, they're Chinese. So you're also creating an ability for your competitors to embed themselves in somebody else's operational chain. So these things are very counterproductive. Last point on this, because this is all lived experience. I'm not just pointing to things that have happened in books. I was in China a few years ago, right before COVID, and it was the last Trump administration. This trade war had been gearing up quite a bit, and I was in a cab with a cab driver who I was trying to have a conversation with, and this gentleman knew a little bit of English, but enough so that we could communicate. And we started talking, and he was actually being very open, and I was enjoying the conversation. He asked me, he said, "So where are you coming from?" And I told him from the US. He said, "Oh, US, new president, this, that, and the other." He said, "Oh, very tough on China." I just smiled, and he said, "Look, lots of Huawei ban, in China." So I said, "Yeah, there seems to be this kind of distrust and so on." He said, Huawei will be the world's best company, and China will never trust the US again." I remember that it was just, and this is not a Chinese official. This is not like, some high-powered Chinese executive. It's just an ordinary Chinese person who is looking at the situation saying, it just feels like you're trying to, prevent our companies that we're proud of from coming up. And now we're kind of all incentivized to make them succeed. So you also saw after that, by the way, when Huawei actually came out with new products, they were thronged. The Chinese people were going out and buying these things en masse. And now Huawei technology, the foldable phones or the trifold, in Asia, I've seen that very, very popular with higher end buyers. And that kind of innovation isn't coming out on the American side. So net, when has this ever worked for us, by the way? It's never worked. People talk to nuclear, and I was just at Davos and I was having a discussion there with some very prominent people. Um, and I said, well, in the case of nuclear, it's worked. Actually, no, it hasn't worked in the case of nuclear. Because first of all, everyone talks about, Kennedy thought that there would be 30, 35 powers that would have nuclear, and look, well, there's only now. No, because the US, included more than 30 countries under our nuclear umbrella, and we agreed that we would use our weapons and enable the defense of these countries. And we've also dispersed our own nuclear weapons and actually kept them in some countries. And that's a whole different story. And if you're interested, look at how some of our nukes were loaded up with no additional locks or protections onto Turkish aircraft with Turkish pilots in the cockpit on the ground at DEFCON 2 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And at that point, if a Turkish pilot wanted to fly anywhere and do whatever they were going to do with the weapon, they could. That DEFCON 2 level at that time enabled them to do that. So point being that this is just, I don't know why we don't learn from history. It's never really worked, including in the case of nuclear. It's never worked. Um, Kim still got his weapon, right? It's never worked. And all it does is just robs American industry from being able to build relationships and to create revenue. And it creates the perception in the mind of the competitor that you're not just competing, you're trying to kill them, you're trying to hold them back. It's there's more meanness in how you are approaching what they're doing than just mere commercial competition. I think it's super silly, and I think it always backfires. It never works, and I don't think it's going to work this time. And I think now we found out because um, this model isn't the only thing that should surprise us. Since Donald Trump was elected, the Chinese have flown two sixth generation fighters, which we have now seen photographed. We haven't seen an American sixth generation fighter flying, but we've seen two Chinese sixth generation fighters. They've launched a new AWACS. They've announced new space missions with regards to new modules in their space station. They've announced the world's largest dam, 60 gigawatts of capacity. They've just approved it in December. They've launched this model, then they've launched R1, the second model, three DeepSeek models, plus on top now this morning, Alibaba was talking about the fact that they have a model that will turn out to be even superior to this. I haven't looked at that, so I don't know. But the point is that a new aircraft carrier, multiple. So the rate at which they're moving forward is tremendous, and to me, it's almost as if this time round, it's kind of a statement of, look, you can sanction, you can do whatever you want, nothing's going to stop us. There are certain areas of technology which we deem strategic. When the world becomes like that, I mean, why not try and figure out ways in which you can actually cooperate? Because very soon we'll find that the best stuff, the best phones already are made in China, the best EVs are already made in China. If the best AI and models are made in China, then what are American consumers using? Third class stuff. Like that isn't fair to the American consumer either. So I think it's very counterproductive.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I think this is the fundamental risk across the board, right? It's the same with like this whole, or you mentioned EVs, the EV tariffs as well, right? It's like, okay, if the Chinese taxpayer are subsidizing stuff and selling cheap EVs to consumers in Europe, etc., it's competition. If you're going to block that competition, what is the incentive for a European or American car maker to compete at that $10,000 price point, right? And at some point, you're only enabling rent seeking in your economy, which you and I, being Pakistani origin, also are familiar with what rent seeking industries can do to your economy, just hollow it
Yep.
out. Last question to you related to where you began this conversation, right? Which is you're not fully confident that we're at that level here in the United States to respond to this in the way that we responded in the Sputnik moment. And I would love to understand why you think that way, because we've had the Stargate announcement, we've had A16Z and others talk about more investments in AI, including open source AI, which is something the Biden administration was not so keen on. So why do you think that we're not fully there yet? And what will, more importantly, take to respond to this in a way that is strategic and innovative and competitive, not just about sanctions?
At the time that the Sputnik moment occurred, America had resources that were vastly greater than the Soviet Union's in almost every sphere. And America was a place where it was a question of focusing on the priority and organizing those resources and applying them to go past the Soviets. And that was the issue. It was a question of focus and what Kennedy brought to when we gave that very famous speech and he organized, galvanized interest and so on and so forth. Today, the situation is very different. There is no disparity between the US and China in economic terms of the type that there was between the US and the Soviet Union. So China has a lot of resources, and in nominal terms, okay, China has a GDP which is smaller than the US's, but in real terms, with adjustments, They have a PPP GDP, which is already substantially larger. And the reason why that counts is because what exactly is the input being used to create, let's say, a new model? Really, it's compute, but frankly, it's also people. And people here at OpenAI, let's say the top X guys, the top cadre, all make more in a year than DeepSeek spent on the entire training run for their model. So none of the DeepSeek guys, the engineers, are getting paid what engineers in Silicon Valley are getting paid. This at least, you can look into this and hopefully those numbers will expose themselves. But there's probably a 10x delta minimum. And that human capital, so at that point, a dollar is a dollar. A dollar in China is $10, right? Because it's 10 times more valuable in terms of the kind of equivalent talent that it can deploy. So China has an
And if I may
abundant.
interrupt, your immigration policies have made it much more difficult to attract that talent out of China now as well, which means that they got nowhere else to go. So they're going to compete in their own ecosystem and just
Yeah.
be there and take pride in being there.
Yeah, there's also kind of this idea around immigration that everybody that came to America was running away from something, and everybody came to America to embrace, freedom and all these things, the types of things that, are in the realm of political rhetoric, right? That you were poor, you had it really miserably bad wherever you were running away from strife, and you came here, and then actually, a large number of people came here because they were fine where they were. However, the kinds of research that they wanted to do, the kinds of work that they wanted to do, America had a concentration of such people from all over the world that were doing that work. And so, what attracted them to America was to say, if I want to be the best people are here, so I ought to be with the best people. That's what pulled us in. In my case, it was very much the case that I applied to this lab at UT Austin, which was called the Distributed Multimedia Computation Lab. I looked at the work that was happening there when I was a teenager, and I applied to them and I wrote to the professor in charge, who, by the way, was not born in America either. He was also an immigrant. And 80% of his lab were immigrants. Even today, 80%, 85% of the master's students in electrical engineering and computer science programs in the US are not born in America. So that's a whole different discussion. But my point is that the Chinese now have the capacity to do this on their own. They're not poor. In fact, in many ways, the key resources required to apply the brain power and build better models, come up with better ideas, they might be buying at 1/10 the cost that the US is buying them at. So there's a very big kind of an advantage. And I just don't think that the breadth of activities that are going on in China, because if you think about it, look, the Chinese have a data advantage. They've got a much larger digitized part of their economy, of their infrastructure. They can capture that data. They've got much more behavioral. They went to digital currency before anybody else did. They've got payment data. They've got lots of data advantage. And they're also 1.4 billion people. So they've got the data advantage. Then they have the entire electronic supply chain. Okay, they don't own NVIDIA, but obviously, even the previous generation NVIDIA chips, you just need more of them and you need to run them for a little bit longer. The deltas are not that, with the older version, it's going to be a billion days, and with the new version, it's going to be 20 days. Those are not the quanta of what separates these generations. It's much smaller. So you can get more of them, or you can run them for a little bit longer, and you can end up even now doing okay with the previous generation. But in the long term, the Chinese are going to move to, TSMC level fabrication. I have zero doubt that that's going to happen. Huawei already shipped chips which are world-class chips, and they're supporting their phones. They couldn't do that before the sanctions, by the way. They couldn't do that. And they had to rely on Western IP. Now they don't. So is anyone who is seriously minded of the opinion that the Chinese will never be able to produce an aircraft engine? The Chinese will never be able to produce a top-end chip? Of course not. They're absolutely going to do all of these things. So that wasn't what you saw in the Soviet Union, that kind of broad economic power that would even be so substantial that it would be larger than the US's power, and that kind of array of talent that was available in all categories that could be marshaled and they could afford to compete in everything, right? The Chinese can afford to compete in steel. They do more steel than the rest of the world put together. Their high-speed rail better than anywhere else in the world. They have just set up, they've set in the last month or two, they've set a new record of the highest amount of data transmitted from a satellite down to Earth using lasers. So the highest throughput record with satellite data transmission. They're ahead on a lot of the quantum communication work. They're ahead in during Bush 2, we placed kind of a moratorium on work having to do with stem cells and human embryos and all of this. There was a complete moratorium. In that time, China built up a capacity, which is now the world's largest capacity of sampling machines. And, they have quite an edge in that area as well. So, there's no comparison between where we were in a relative competition with the Soviet Union, which allowed us to swing back real quick and dominate the space race. And even then, the Soviet Union gave us a run for the money. But now, in the case of China, I just don't think that it's going to be that easy.
Always a pleasure talking to you, learning from you, and I think I agree that this is going to be a stiff race and a race where the United States needs to compete more so than rely on sanctions as a means to stay ahead. In fact, as we've discussed, sanctions can be counterproductive. So let's see what comes next. But in the realm of innovation, these are exciting times. So I will continue to bother you, if you don't mind, over the next few months as more news comes out, more innovation comes out. But as always, love talking to you and always learn a lot. Thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you very much, Uzair. And yes, we should definitely keep talking about this. And of course, innovation and trying to build new cool things is the whole purpose of my existence. So I look at these as highly motivating events. I don't look at this as China versus US, or I don't get pulled down by any of this. I look at this and say, this is possible to do. So let's go and try and figure out
Yeah.
what the next thing is. And I think that's kind of the mindset we should be in as Americans, which is to say, okay, this has been done. Let's move on to the next thing, and not cry and complain about who stole what and there's plenty of that blame to go around.
Fully agree. Thank you so much. We'll talk
All right,
soon.
all the
Good
best to you.
afternoon.
Take care.